there has been this consistent messaging that the loss of Crimea would actually be sufficiently intolerable to Russia that, in fact, this would be one of the things that would provoke Russia into doing something madly destructive, like launching nuclear weapons. All of the indicators that we see suggest that no, in fact, Russia would be quite content to pocket that loss, because why would you turn a loss in a war that is tolerable into something which could be absolutely catastrophic and an existential threat like a nuclear exchange? There are all kinds of reasons why the nuclear intimidation, the nuclear rhetoric that is tied to Crimea specifically, has been very effective in toning down Western responses, in toning down the support that Ukraine has for exerting its power and for trying to liberate those occupied areas, including Crimea. We don't think they stand up to scrutiny.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And today we are joined by Keir Giles, a Russia watcher at the international affairs think tank Chatham House. He's previously worked at the UK Defence Academy, writing and advising on issues ranging from Russian military, defence and security issues to strategy and doctrine. He's the author of multiple publications explaining the Russian approach to warfare, and his latest book is Russia's War on Everybody and What It Means for You. Keir Giles, great to see you on Frontline. Thank you for your time today.
Hello.
From your vast knowledge of Russia and its approach to warfare, does the way it is fighting the war in Ukraine now fit with what you would have expected?
Well, there was a lot of surprise, as we all know, with the launch of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February of last year, that Russia was doing something that seemed to be completely not fitting at all with the expectations for how it fought wars. But that, of course, was all bound up with the way Russia had convinced himself that this was not going to be a war. And since then, it's not so much a question of living up to expectations by Russia. It's more kind of living down to expectations, a period of adjustment in Russia falling back on the tried and tested ways that it has actually fought wars in the past. So there have been the adoption of all kinds of different methods of winning war over the course of this 18 months of war that we've seen from Russia beforehand, and also from Russia thinking about the nature of war during the period when its armed forces were broken and incapable after the end of the Cold War, but also tactical adaptation as well. So it's a mix, in a way, of the old methods and new means of adapting to the challenges that they're finding on the front in Ukraine. It's recognizably still a Russian army, and in some respects, of course, that means something that throws back a long way into history. Some of the ways in which Russia has managed to bring together its manpower from drawing deep on its resources, springing convicts from jail to throw them into the front line with no training, is something which would be unrecognizable for any Western military, and yet somehow seems to fit comfortably in the Russian tradition. But at the same time, of course, this technological innovation that goes along with the deep layers of fortifications and minefields and trenches and so on that look like a throwback to a previous era. So in short, it's a mix. Yes, we know that this is Russia, but at the same time, they are learning, adapting, and evolving.
Yes, because there was a lot of criticism at the beginning about the way that Russia was conducting itself and its strategies and tactics. I mean, when you say it has adapted, what have you seen that is unusual or in the way that it has evolved?
Well, let's take, for instance, the war in the air. And by that, I mean not the airstrikes that Russia carries out and the missile strikes against Ukrainian cities, against civilians, against the critical national infrastructure, which for a time, again, was part of a standard Russian approach for winning a war if you can't win it on the battlefield by trying to bring the civilian population to its knees. Instead, thinking about the drone war and the short-range drones, the ones that are carrying out attacks on the front lines. That's a very rapid evolution, and it's an evolution that's in competition with Ukraine, that is also reaching for technological innovation to overcome the countermeasures of the other side and deliver the effects that they need to by developing very rapidly new generations of drones.
Many commentators have expressed the view that President Putin wants a long, drawn-out war. How much pressure is that putting on Russian artillery and weapons supplies and manpower? And is that the only reason, do you think, he really needed to invite Kim Jongun to Russia?
Well, of course, Putin didn't want a long, drawn-out war to start with. He thought this was going to be a swift decapitation operation that Ukraine would fall into his hands without a need for a war at all. But now, of course, drawing the war out does play to some of Russia's strengths. Not all of them, but Russia has been able to tap into those mobilization reserves, those enormous stocks of weapons left over from the Cold War that they saved for a rainy day. And now we see exactly why. They had these enormous tank parks, the thousands and thousands of tons of ammunition and so on. And those are the stocks that Russia has been burning through, trying to wage this war of destruction against Ukraine. Now, At some point, of course, that has to come to an end. Now, at some point, that has to come to an end, and that's why we have seen these suggestions that Putin is actually looking for sources to replenish his ammunition, both the old stocks that he can seek from sources like North Korea, and, of course, the more modern munitions that he's looking for his other partners in crime, like Iran, for. So, yes, as this process of both working through the old stocks and this adaptation continues, there are new sources of munitions coming in for Russia. But the biggest problem, of course, is that for as long as this war is not coming to an end, Russia probably has more stamina for it than this Western coalition of states that are backing Ukraine. They too have to look for arms and munitions around the world for as long as they haven't actually restarted their own defense industries. So they too are scrambling for what they can provide to Ukraine, and the stocks are finite.
What's your takeaway from this meeting between Kim Jong un and President Putin?
Well, we probably won't know for some time exactly, or if ever, what exactly was agreed there. That's something which will only emerge over time as we see the concrete form of whatever new cooperation is actually happening between the two countries. But it's also a sign of Russia's new status in the world. Now, Russia will be reasonably happy with the fact that all eyes of the world are actually on Putin, waiting for this meeting, watching Kim's train trundling slowly across the Russian Far East. It's a little bit like the old days when Russia mattered and it was important and it was in the headlines for something other than committing genocide. It's had the same kind of media circus around it as once upon a time a meeting between the heads of the Soviet Union and the USA might have had. So, in that respect, Russia likes the attention, and of course, it likes to think that it is at the front of everybody's minds all of the time. But in reality, it's Russia turning to this small circle of fellow rogue states who will help each other out. And which of the different needs that each is filling, Russia and North Korea, and how that's actually going to translate into real agreements, we still won't know for some time, and there may not be a public announcement. It's something that we'll see the shape of emerging over time.
And now we see China's top diplomat, Wang Yi, will begin a 4-day trip to Russia today, which could be followed by a landmark trip by President Putin to Beijing. We don't know that yet for sure, but it could be. What do you think is going to be going on with Mr. Wang's visit?
Again, impossible to tell without actually being the fly on the wall in the room. But there's a question over whether China is actually going to continue to be patient with what Russia is doing, because China had every right in the early stages of this war to be really quite upset with Russia after having been promised a short, victorious war which would not cause a great deal of disruption. Instead, they have this long, drawn out conflict which is actually causing chaos on the world markets that China also depends on. And furthermore, of course, China has the luxury of sitting back and watching how this conflict plays out. It can sit on the sidelines and see its two major competitors, Russia and this Western bloc, actually weakening each other, and potentially could afterwards step in and pick up the pieces. But at the same time, there have also been the suggestion that China is not particularly happy with some of the ways Russia has been conducting itself, particularly in the early stages of the conflict with these nuclear threats, these nuclear intimidation that Russia was throwing around very freely. It's plausible that there was a word from China to tone that down, and that's one of the reasons why we hear a great deal less of that. So there is a lot for the two sides to talk about, but naturally the rest of the world will be watching this and hoping that there isn't going to be any kind of closer cooperation between China and Russia that would actually lead to a direct impact on the war against Ukraine.
In Ukraine itself, we understand that Russia has redeployed paratroopers to the southern front to support the 58th Combined Arms Army against Ukrainian advances. According to the British Ministry of Defence, it says they're using them to plug holes in overstretched ground forces. They say it would be regarded as highly unsatisfactory by unit commanders. Why?
Well, the fact that Russia is plugging holes in the first place after so many months of being able to prepare their defenses, to train their troops and so on, is an indication that Russia is on the back foot. And in that respect, it's also burning through some of the most experienced troops that they have remaining after their ground forces have been decimated by the earlier months of fighting to try to hold the line against the Ukrainian advance. Now, the way in which Russia has deployed its troops, supplied them, provisioned them, and the logistics support has been an ongoing source of dissatisfaction, it seems, from the Russian military. And of course, let's not forget that was one of the root causes of the major argument between Yevgeny Prigozhin, the Wagner boss, and the Ministry of Defense, how exactly the war was being fought. So yes, we'll probably continue to hear these indications that people are not satisfied with the way in which they are actually being used on the front line. But overall, it's just an indication indicator that after many months of trying, Ukraine is actually achieving some success on that line.
Crimea has come under sustained attack by Ukraine, rendering the dry docks for the entire Black Sea Fleet likely to be unusable for some months to come, twice knocking out Russia's sophisticated S-400 surface-to-air missile systems and radar positions on offshore gas platforms. It's a key target, Crimea, with its air bases and its troop concentrations, its training grounds. What options would be left for Russia, do you think, if Crimea were to be cut off or even retaken?
Well, the situation of Crimea has always been unnatural. Well before this war started, the fact that Russia had seized this peninsula with no actual physical links to the mainland, which was dependent on Ukraine for a water supply, was basically untenable without Ukrainian cooperation anyway. So if it's brought back to that situation where it cannot actually be supplied, it cannot actually have free logistics between itself and the mainland, then obviously that's going to be a severe problem for Russia. But more immediately, what all of these campaigns, what all of these operations against Crimea are doing are reducing the role of Crimea in exerting that stranglehold on Ukraine, because Crimea sitting there was effectively a block on the Ukrainian economy. It's been the way in which Russia has tried to reduce the amount of sea exports, sea trade that Ukraine can actually engage in. Even before the war, the fact that the Kerch Bridge was across this strait that leads to the Sea of Azov and Ukraine's eastern ports was putting limits on how much sea traffic could go in and out. So for as long as Crimea is there, it's serving the purpose that Russia wanted it for. It's an outpost. It's a way of projecting power into an area that they don't otherwise control, in exactly the same way that Kaliningrad at the other end of Europe projects power into the Baltic Sea. So it is a major target for Ukraine because as long as it's under Russian control, it is going to pose the same kind of problem for Ukraine's viability as a state.
But were it to not be under Russia's control, what would the consequences be for Russia and its war-fighting effort?
Russia would very much like us to think that the consequences would be dire for everybody. There has been this consistent messaging that the loss of Crimea would actually be sufficiently intolerable to Russia that, in fact, this would be one of the things that would provoke Russia into doing something madly destructive, like launching nuclear weapons. All of the indicators that we see suggest that no, in fact, Russia would be quite content to pocket that loss, because why would you turn a loss in a war that is tolerable into something which could be absolutely catastrophic and an existential threat like a nuclear exchange? There are all kinds of reasons why the nuclear intimidation, the nuclear rhetoric that is tied to Crimea specifically, has been very effective in toning down Western responses, in toning down the support that Ukraine has for exerting its power and for trying to liberate those occupied areas, including Crimea. We don't think they stand up to scrutiny.
When those kind of nuclear threats are made and that insinuation that they may resort to some kind of nuclear attack, I mean, what do you think the West should read into it? How do you think they should react? Should they dismiss it as just ridiculous saber rattling, perhaps a response to something else going wrong in the Russian forces during the war? What's your assessment?
There's an element of it that is ridiculous. There's a strong element of it that is saber rattling. Not all of it should be dismissed. The part that people need to watch for is not just the rhetoric, the frothing, the swivel-eyed lunatics on television, the loose statements by President Putin, but instead what Russia actually does, and specifically what Russia's armed forces do, because they're the ones that own the nuclear missiles. They're the ones that would operate them or would actually fire them when called upon to do so. And it's when they start doing something different that people would need to worry. The point is, we haven't seen any of that yet, and nor has Russia needed to do any of that, because the nuclear intimidation is incredibly effective since it builds on a long-term intensive program over almost a decade of every single arm of Russia's propaganda machine trying to create this hype, this idea that there is a nuclear danger, that Russia is on a hair trigger, and that if you offend or impede Russia in any way, then you're risking this uncontrollable escalation. Again, that too doesn't really stand up to scrutiny, but it's formed the basis of the conversation in the West for so long, and that in itself is a major success for Russian information operations. Instead, we say, look at the genuine risk, and instead of paying attention to the graphics on TV that show us all being annihilated, instead consider what the real position of Russia, in particular its armed forces, is.
Isn't the real risk, the most genuine risk, these Zaporizhzhia nuclear plants? Because if there are problems over the winter with supplies of energy to that plant, the reactors can't be kept cool. Isn't that the biggest risk?
It's one of the biggest risks, and it's one of the reasons why Russia should, as rapidly as possible, be removed from control of the Zaporozhye nuclear plant. It's something that they have fallen back on as a means of exerting nuclear pressure after the direct threats were proved to be ineffective. We've heard all of these stories about dirty bombs. We've heard the threats to actually use the Zaporozhye nuclear plant to create a nuclear incident. It's just one of the ways in which Russia is keeping the pressure on, and it's something that the West should work very hard to dissuade.
So, Keir, you wrote an article recently in response to the report that Elon Musk thwarted a Ukrainian military operation in Crimea by switching off the Starlink satellite system. You say this is just one example of the roles being played by tech companies in Ukraine. What else has made an impact?
Well, first of all, that incident that made the headlines last week about Elon Musk interdicting a Ukrainian operation against the Black Sea Fleet was just one of several instances where Starlink service has either not been provided or has been suddenly cut off when Ukraine is actually carrying out military operations. In October last year, February this year, there are instances when Ukraine was relying on the service and then suddenly didn't have it anymore. So this is part of a pattern. And of course, people are queuing up to accuse Elon Musk of being a Kremlin sympathizer. But what actually seems to be happening in these cases is it is other factors which are preventing Ukraine from using the service. They're relying on something which is subject to geofencing. It doesn't work in certain areas. And it's also reliant on terms of service, which weren't including using it for offensive drone operations. And that's a symptom of how this reliance on technology companies overall in this conflict has become so very deep. And it's not just Starlink, it's also names that are household names to all of us, like Microsoft, like Amazon, like Google. They've all played a role in the technological support of Ukraine's war effort. Ukraine had evacuated all of its, a large proportion of its government data out of the country, out of places that were likely to be overrun in advance of the invasion. It was Amazon that helped them do that. Google has extended its protection, its network protection over Ukrainian websites to keep them functioning in the face of being hammered by Russian cyber attacks. And Microsoft plays a cybersecurity role across an enormous range of Ukrainian networks and computers. All of them are on the side of Ukraine in this. And that's one of the things that has made Russian cyber operations so very difficult because they're operating in a hostile environment. But that also raises questions about future conflicts as well. If anybody else is going to be reliant to such an extent on private industry and on the goodwill of private industry to provide these services, sometimes free, sometimes funded by other governments, could they find themselves in a situation like with Starlink when suddenly something that they are absolutely reliant on is taken away?
Of course, Elon Musk doesn't only own Starlink, he also owns Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it. I mean, and this has personally impacted on you.
Well, it's not just me. In Twitter, too, there are also doubts and accusations about where exactly Musk's sympathies lie, because there has been this boosting of voices that amplify Russian disinformation, while at the same time suppressing those voices that stand against Russia or support Ukraine. And in my personal case, it's a very simple shadow banning, which refers to hiding my account. So if you search for Keir Giles on Twitter, you won't actually see my main account. It's been suppressed. You'll see one that I've set up as a dummy to try to lead people to the main account. But that's happened to thousands of different people who are strongly vocal in support of Ukraine and critical of Russia. And it's just another one of the reasons people suspect that Elon Musk has been somehow induced or persuaded to support the Kremlin.
President Zelensky is at the UN General Assembly in New York. This coincides with the news that 6 of his deputy defence ministers have been dismissed, with the department needing a new approach. How important is it that he can show he can still do the everyday politics of reform while fighting a war?
It's vital for Ukraine to continue to overcome this reputation that it had for being a hotbed of corruption, and for the narrative that you hear, particularly from the United States, sometimes about the aid that is going to Ukraine actually being directly funneled into Ukraine in the form of cash, and they're being pocketed by corrupt Ukrainian officials. It's been a strange reluctance on the part of some of Ukraine's Western backers to actually explain where the money goes. Either it's sunk costs in the form of arms that have already been bought, or it's actually being invested in defense industries across the West. It's very different from the picture that you get displayed by the Russian propagandists and those in the United States that disapprove of this support going to Ukraine. But at the same time, Ukraine does have to continue these efforts to put its own house in order. And we're seeing very strong indications that that is precisely what is happening. After all, they are fighting a war of national survival, so it stands to reason that they should want to do that in the most efficient way possible.
I mentioned your latest book in the introduction, in which you argue that the West has underestimated Russia's influence and intentions, that it seeks to operate below the threshold of outright war. It wants to sow divisions in societies and to enhance its own security. Could you just explain that a little bit more?
Well, that's something that has faded a little bit into the background in most people's minds in the context of this live war, this actual conflict where lives are being lost at the far end of Europe from us. But it's something that has not gone away. The way in which Russia tries to influence countries, to influence politicians, to bring people around to doing what Moscow wants instead of what serves their own interests or Russian national interests, is something that we're going to see come back again in full force as soon as Russia is not so fully engaged and distracted by Ukraine again. And so many of the levers that it had to do that, and these are levers which have very direct and personal impacts on people's lives, are going to be once again directed against us. And that's the reason why I called the book you're referring to Russia's War on Everybody, because the key point that came out from all of the interviews that I did for that, all of the collection of the first person eyewitness stories, was precisely this human impact. Everything that Russia does means something real for people, and it is incredibly damaging. It's not just the fact that there are people who are being killed, maimed, having their families destroyed at the far end of Europe. Wherever Russia can reach, it touches lives in a terrible way.
If the invasion of Ukraine is to be the wake-up call, though, in the way that the West regards Russia, what do you think it should learn?
We've had so many wake-up calls. And the hope for people like me who've been watching Russia over decades was that each one would be the one that finally brought Western publics, but especially Western politicians, to the realization that we're dealing with a long-term problem in Russia, something that can't be fixed through a policy reset or even through bringing the war in Ukraine to an end. Instead, it's a long-term systemic challenge. If Ukraine does succeed, and we all hope it does, if it manages to evict the last Russian soldier from the occupied territories in eastern Ukraine and Crimea, that doesn't mean that the war is necessarily going to be over. Because for Russia, this is the forever war. There's nothing to stop them sitting on the border, lobbing missiles and drones into Ukraine to continue to pulverize its economy and kill its people while it rebuilds its army for the next attempt. Because for Russia, this simply will not be over. What that means is that for Europe, it's absolutely vital and long overdue to restart production in defense industries, to retool, to rearm, and to rebuild the militaries, because the holiday from history that Europe has had over the last 30 years, when they could pretend that there is not a hard security threat at the other end of the continent, is well and truly over. And it is genuinely, as you said, time to wake up.
Is there a diplomatic solution long term, though, with Russia?
The only way there'll be a diplomatic solution with Russia is if Russia as a whole, not just the leadership, but also its people, changes its mind about what Russia is and what it wants from Europe. For as long as Russia thinks that it is entitled to an empire, that it's entitled to invade its neighbors to try to reconstitute the Russian empire, there is always going to be a clash between Moscow and those countries that think the people around Russia's periphery are entitled to determine their own future and not be invaded by Russia. That's a basic, fundamental contradiction that nobody's going to be able to resolve by diplomacy.
Keir Giles, it's been great to talk to you. Thank you very much for your time. You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. My thanks to Louis Sykes, our producer. To support the work of Frontline, hit the subscribe button. You can also listen to Times Radio throughout the day or read it at times.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.